Thank you so much for this award. It's a great honor. It's one of the signal honors of my life. I will treasure these books greatly, and the thought behind them and the award is really really spectacular. It's a pleasure to be with you all here tonight during these very eventful times. What I'd like to talk about is, though, to get you away from the headlines, to move beyond them. To get right now, we're all concerned with dirty land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the ground keeps moving beneath our feet, and the world is changing in ways that are, that are hidden from the media, but which are going to have real profound consequences. Let me start with this. The sum total effect of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, too, has been to fast forward the arrival of the Asian century. I don't just mean that in an economic sense, which we all know about and have all known about since the late 1970s. I mean it in a military sense as well. While the U.S. military is occupied in Mesopotamia and in Afghanistan, and European defense budgets are starved, the militaries of China, India, Korea, Japan are growing apace. The Indian Navy is now the 5th largest navy in the world. It is about to become the 3rd largest navy in the world. Japan has, with a very small percentage of Japan's gross domestic product devoted to the military. Remember, Japan has the 2nd largest economy in the world. Japan puts to sea 4 times as many warships now as the British Royal Navy. The British Royal Navy is going down in size from 42 to 29, and the Japanese put about 123 warships at sea. And when I talk about the growth of these Asian militaries, I don't mean just in size, because one of the things we learned at the end of the Cold War, when NATO had to modernize militaries in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, etc., was you make a military better not by making it bigger, but sometimes by making it smaller. You take a big ox and cow army military that just does nothing but clean the roads and haul in the forage, which is really a vehicle for nation building, and you turn it into something volunteer, high-tech, very professional, and smaller in size. That is what all these Asian countries have been doing. What we're seeing is, whereas in the first decades after the Cold War, Asian militaries were focused inward on nation building, on, as I said before, on hauling in the crop, on building roads, doing things like grunt soldiers did then. But Asia is emerging as a set of outwardly focused, armed with missiles, civilian military post-industrial complexes, and which is really, in a way, changing the face of the world. Europe is receding as a military power. It's dying as a military power. And the reason I can say this is because when you look at military power, the first thing you should look at is the civil-military relationship inside that country. And the United States, we have all these tensions with our military because we've been a volunteer military since the mid-1970s. Most civilians don't even know the naval command structure. If you say something like lieutenant commander or ensign, or a naval captain is the equivalent of an Army colonel, most civilians don't know what you're talking about. But nevertheless, despite unpopular wars, the military is very respected in America, and Americans have been comfortable, relatively so, with relatively high degrees of casualties the last 5 or 6 years. In Europe, it's a completely different story. In Europe, people look upon their own militaries as sort of civil servants in uniforms, who are there for peacekeeping, for humanitarian assistance, but not necessarily to fight. But the truth is that the better a military trains to fight, the better it does at disaster relief, at peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance. Because most peacekeeping is monopolizing the use of force in any given area. And humanitarian assistance is about the same thing as combat. It's about logistics, logistics, logistics. It's about getting material and other supplies to a given area very, very quickly. So we're really entering an Asian military century. The Navy is, the U.S. Navy issued its strategy document in late 2007, which was followed by a Marine strategy document, I believe, in early 2008. And if you read them closely, they both say the same thing. In so many words, they say we're no longer going to be a two-ocean, Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean Navy, and the Marine Corps will no longer focus on the Atlantic and the Pacific. They will still be two-ocean military forces, but they're going to be focused instead on the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. To deal with this rise of Asia as a great strategic area, and will no longer be, in a sense, an Atlantic power. That is a massive change. Because during the Cold War, the Atlantic was critical. It was about bottling up the Soviet Navy near the polar ice cap. But in the new world we're entering, the fighting, the relief is going to be in the tropics. It's interesting that the Indian Ocean is emerging as the world's main strategic energy interstate, connecting all the oil and liquefied natural gas from the Persian Gulf and the Near East to the middle-class flesh pots of East Asia and the Indonesian archipelago that are rising. And let me tell you a story. Let me just break to tell you a story. I was in Sri Lanka last spring, and I was there for the end of a 25-year-old civil war that ended while I was there covering it. And I found myself at a construction site in the southern tip of Sri Lanka. It was the most massive construction site that I had ever laid eyes on. It went on for miles. And it was filled with hundreds of Chinese workers, civil engineers, directing literally mile-long lines of dump trucks, carrying soil in a switchback fashion from the bottom of this massive several-kilometer-long pit to the top, about 100 meters up. And the Chinese civil engineers were, by the way, it's a great time in history to be a Chinese civil engineer, because they are doing all these massive construction projects all over the world, in Africa with the Olympics, in the things I'm going to talk about now. They were essentially moving the coast inland by a few hundred meters to build the Hambantota seaport, which is going to be a super modern bunkering facility, military complex, seaport, close to the main sea lines of communication where 30,000 merchant vessels pass each year. And the Chinese were building this for the Sri Lankans, but the Chinese would have access to it. And the way that, you may have read a line or two or one front page story, when the Sri Lankan Civil War ended between the Sinhalese Buddhists who ran the government and the Hindu Tamil Tigers in the north. But one thing you probably didn't read about was that the Chinese, in effect, won this war. They came out on top. They came out on top because a few years ago, the United States and other Western powers stopped giving Sri Lanka military and economic aid because of human rights abuses. And the Chinese came in and filled the gap. The Chinese don't go in and give moral lectures about civil rights, human rights. They came in, they flushed the Sri Lankan army with everything from T-54 knockoffs of AK-47 assault rifles, all the way up to fighter jets and anti-missile radar batteries. They gave them everything they needed. They took Sri Lankan soldiers and sent them to the best Chinese military schools in China. And most importantly, They had their backs at the UN. If anyone tried to raise a resolution protesting the human rights abuses of the Sri Lankan government, the Chinese would veto it. And safe with this Chinese protection, the Sri Lankan government methodically planned out an endgame that won this war, defeated, destroyed, killed the whole leadership of the Tamil Tigers. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because the Chinese are doing something similar in Burma, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan. They're building these massive port projects. They're getting closer and closer to these governments in a diplomatic, economic, and military sense. And they're not going to own these ports. That's not subtle enough. The Chinese are extremely subtle. What they're doing is that they're going to have access to all these ports that they build for their merchant fleet and their military fleet. Because the Chinese guarding the Western Pacific are just a one-ocean navy. But with ports all through the Indian Ocean, they become a two-ocean navy and a great world power. Now, you've noticed I've been talking a lot about navies tonight. And the reason is because while we're all focused with tunnel vision on two dirty land wars, a naval past is behind us and a naval future is ahead of us. 90% of all commercial goods around the world travel by sea, even in this jet age. Most oil and liquefied natural gas goes by sea. Over the next 20 years, there's going to be a 45% increase in oil and natural gas extraction from the Middle East. And half of that is going to be gobbled up by India and China, which means sea lanes across the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific are going to be clogged. And the Chinese no longer want to depend on the United States to free ride on the good services of the United States to protect the global sea lines of communication, the global commons. The Chinese want a world-class navy to do this on their own, and they're building one. They may acquire one or two carriers. They have a shop-till-you-drop strategy on nuclear and diesel-electric submarines, which are the real instruments of war. Look at it this way. When you look at the Indian Ocean, when you look at this whole southern rimland surrounding Eurasia, the Chinese are moving south to these deep water ports, and the Indians, the other great rising power, are moving east and west. Chinese vertically down, India horizontal on each side. It's interesting in India nowadays. I go back and forth there often. And there's a movement in India amongst Indian intellectuals and strategists. They're called neo-Curzonians. And it tells you a lot about where India is going. Lord George Nathaniel Curzon was the British Viceroy of India between 1899 and 1905. And he was the British Viceroy when British India was at its peak, so to speak. And he had this idea of India as the center of the world with shadow zones of influence in the Persian Gulf, in Iran, in Burma, all the way from the Iranian plateau to the Gulf of Thailand. And nowadays, separated by some decades from British colonial rule, Indian intellectuals can finally appreciate Curzon. And they can finally see that while he was British, he was still operating from the same geographical space as they are, as current Indian prime ministers. So where does the chief of the Indian Navy make his first visit? To the Persian Gulf, to the sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf, India's new sphere of influence. At Burma, if you look at Pakistan as sort of the Balkans, a place that can completely come apart, look at Burma as Belgium before the First World War, where Indian and Chinese goals and territorial pretensions cross-hatch and overlap. And Burma has one of the world's most repressive, benighted military regimes. It's also very rich in timber, liquefied natural gas, all sorts of minerals and other things. India is a model democracy. Burma is one of the most repressive states in the world. But the Indians cannot afford to stand on moral ceremony and not do business with Burma. So they're training the Burmese army. They're building all these complexes in Burma because the Indians are afraid of the Chinese moving south. The Indians feel threatened and surrounded by the Chinese, who are building these ports, as I said, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, all surrounding India. And it makes the Indians very nervous. If you go to India today and you speak to Indian intellectuals, their obsession with Pakistan is ending and their obsession with China is beginning. India has been dehyphenated from Pakistan and is now a place increasingly we compare with China. Now, when I talk about all this, think of the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans as one world. The only way between the Indian and Western Pacific Oceans now is the Strait of Malacca, separating Indonesia from Malaysia. Hu Jintao, the Chinese president, bemoans his country's Malacca dilemma, meaning all that oil, all that liquefied natural gas fueling China's boom has to come through one strait, one narrow strait. China is a victim of geography. So what is going to become in the early 21st century? We're likely to see a canal dug across the Isthmus of Thailand, the Kra Canal. We're likely to see land bridges and cross-peninsula pipelines connecting the Bay of Bengal with the South China Sea. In other words, providing alternatives to the Strait of Malacca and making this whole maritime rimland from the Horn of Africa stretching all the way around to the Sea of Japan as one essential area. In the early part of World War II, there was an American geostrategist by the name of Nicholas Spykman. He was of Dutch descent and he taught at Yale. And he was writing at a time when it was unclear whether the US would win the war. And he worried about the Nazis or some fascist power gaining control of what he called the world island, which was Eurasia with the southern Eurasian rimland with Africa as well. Now, we don't have that problem anymore. But what I've been describing to you is the emergence not of one power dominating this whole world island or the Eastern Hemisphere or the old world. It's a system of trade that's emerging, where China and India will be the first among equals. And this provides a great opportunity for the United States, because these great Asian powers distrust each other greatly. And the United States Navy and the United States is the only Asian power that everyone can trust because we have no territorial pretensions in the area. And as I said, it's going to be a very subtle trading system that emerges. The Chinese are now in the midst of commemorating an early Ming Dynasty explorer who sailed the seven seas in the early 1400s by the name of Cheng He. And Cheng He sailed his treasure fleet from the Western Pacific, from Canton, from Hong Kong, through the Strait of Malacca, all the way through around India, what is now Pakistan, the Persian Gulf, all the way through to the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. Precisely what are today's sea lines of communication, connecting the oil and natural gas from one part of the world to the Asian flesh pots on the other. In other words, the Chinese are laying claim to this area, by the celebration of this Ming Dynasty explorer. And it's not only this part of the world too that we have to think about. We're seeing the reemergence of classical geography in general. We may have won the Cold War, but Russia is emerging as is re-emerging as a great land power in Eurasia. Russia has plans to build pipelines directly to Western Europe, natural gas pipelines, therefore cutting off Eastern Europe. Increasingly, Eastern Europeans are worried about a new sphere of Russian influence over the former Warsaw Pact countries. Russia can help us with Afghanistan because Russia has the same fears about an Islamic emergence in its southern shadow zone. So our interests are the same as Russia's in Afghanistan, in a way. But Russia cannot help us in Iran because it has an unspoken deal with Iran that the Iranians will not stoke Islamic sentiment in former Soviet Central Asia and the Caucasus. And in return, Russia will not put pressure on Iran to give up its nuclear, its budding nuclear option. So because of geography, it's going to be hard to get Russia on board helping us in Iran. And meanwhile, we have the greater Middle East. And as I've spoken of before here, the Middle East, when you look at it, is like an emerging set of messy Mexico-style scenarios. What do I mean by that? Mexico was a simple country for the US to deal with about 20 years ago. It was a one-party state with one address, one fax number, the president of Mexico, who, if we had any problem, we could deal with him. And because it was essentially a one-party state, we held moral power over Mexico because we were a full-fledged democracy. We had the moral upper hand. But now Mexico is no longer a one-party state. It has a feisty democracy. The Mexican president can't deliver the goods to us the way he used to be able to. We now have to lobby and deal with hundreds of major figures in Mexico. And because Mexico is a democracy, we no longer hold the moral upper hand. So dealing with Mexico is harder because it's a democracy than when it wasn't 20 years ago or so. The same thing in various ways is happening across the Middle East, whether it's Morocco, Algeria, Yemen, some of the Gulf states. These places are becoming gradually less autocratic and increasingly less under central control. We bemoan the anarchy in Iraq and in the Palestinian territories in Gaza. But those places are the future of many places in the Middle East. Not that they'll get to the levels of incoherence that we've seen in Iraq and Gaza, but that it will be harder and harder to do business with only one dictator. If we have a crisis, it won't just be a matter of a few addresses and telephone numbers to contact. The current and future generation of autocrats in the Middle East will not have the luxury to rule quite as autocratically as the last generation. And that's going to make US policy much more difficult, much more challenging in all these places, because the raw fact is that in many cases, the dictators who we've denounced on one hand for being dictators, but on the other hand have found it easy to deal with, are often more enlightened and more liberal-minded than their populations are. As I've often said, that the Saudi royal family are the worst possible people to be running Saudi Arabia, except for any other people in Saudi Arabia. And so we're entering into a far more complex, difficult world. We still live in a unipolar world. The United States Navy still dominates the sea lines. The Air Force dominates the airspace. But it will become increasingly less so as the years go along. So what is the strategy for the United States? Well, first of all, the word decline is, in my opinion, overrated. It's overrated because in the early 1890s, the British Royal Navy began to decline, and it did. The 1890s was the apex of British power. But that did not prevent Britain from winning both World War I and World War II some 5.5 decades later. It was such a gradual decline that it was more theoretical than anything else for several decades. And I think that's where the United States is now. In the 1890s, the British made the rational decision that they couldn't keep building warships the way they are. So what did they do? They had two powers at the time that they trusted greatly: the United States, which was emerging, and Japan at the time. So they leveraged Japanese and American power so that they could start a studied retreat from parts of the world. In other words, hand over responsibility to like-minded others in a responsible way as, as your glory days start to retreat. Well, let me give you some facts about the US Navy. At the end of the Cold War, we had a 600-ship Navy. A few years later, it was down to 350 ships under the Clinton era, I believe. We're now down, the latest figure I heard was 281 warships. There's a goal to get it up above 300 to about 313, but the Congressional Budget Office tells a different story of cost overruns and production delays. I saw one figure 2 weeks ago, I was briefed, where there are some analytics out there saying, kind of assuming a 250-ship Navy in the years to come. That's still the world's greatest Navy, by the way. And that still will allow the United States to play the role of an honest broker, the balancer, the first among equals in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, clearly. And it will do this by building up ports in the South Pacific, outside of Chinese missile range, and from there, continue to guard the sea lanes from the Sea of Japan to the Horn of Africa. But it will get harder and harder, because there comes a point when quantity becomes quality, because a ship can't be at two places at once in an age of mushrooming merchant shipping and with 90% of all goods and services going by ship. So, we're gradually entering a period where we need to leverage and build up and partner with allies, even more so than we have in the past, like Japan, like India, like Indonesia. Let me say a few words about India and Indonesia. The rise of India is probably the best piece of good luck the United States has had in 2 decades, because we don't need an alliance with India. India wouldn't want a defense alliance with us. Just simply by rising in the way that it is, in the economic and military way it is, it's a natural counterbalance to China. And a way not to contain China, that's a bad word, but to keep China honest, so to speak. And Indonesia was a country people gave up on about 11 years ago. They thought that only the Dutch could run such a far-flung archipelago, 3,000 miles across. But Indonesia has surprised people. It's held together. It just had a very successful presidential election. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. It's going to be a major power in the 21st century. And when I spoke to Indonesian officials, I made a visit there earlier this year. This is the largest Muslim country in the world, and they welcomed more U.S. warships in the region. And they welcomed it because they, like every other country in the Pacific, is going to have China as their biggest trading partner. That can't be helped. Those are the facts. But they themselves cannot balance against China. They need an outside power to do it for them. So what I'm saying, to sum up, is that we have great, enormous responsibilities ahead of us, even as our Navy begins to slowly decline. We will be bottled up in Iraq for some more years. We're never leaving Iraq in the near future, whatever you may read about. We're now still at 120,000 troops. We may drop down to 50,000 troops, a dramatic drawdown that will occur in the next 2 or 3 years. But several tens of thousands of American troops will be required to keep the Iraqi military going. So we're going to be in Iraq. Afghanistan is, looks like is promising to be the longest war America's fought, outdistancing Vietnam. We'll be in Iraq and Afghanistan, and our Navy and Marine Corps is going to have all these responsibilities around the southern Eurasian rimland. Geopolitics has not gone away, and it's going to be a very interesting age that we're living in. Thank you very much. Thank you.